Hello, my name is Rachel Peat. I'm currently studying the Level 6 Diploma in Dog Behaviour and Training, and this is my oral presentation to explain the unintended consequences of respondent conditioning, and this is for Module 4 of Level 6. Pavlovian classical or respondent conditioning is an associative learning process where a neutral stimulus becomes associated with an unconditioned stimulus in order to elicit a conditioned response. The Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov discovered respondent conditioning whilst carrying out studies on the secretion of gastric juices, and dogs were his main subjects. He noticed that when food was introduced, the dogs would begin to salivate, so he decided to push his studies a little bit further, and he introduced the sound of a bell or a metronome before offering any food. At first, the dogs didn't take any notice of the bell or the metronome. It meant absolutely nothing. That was because conditioning or pairing hadn't occurred with that particular stimulus. Following conditioning, when the bell or the metronome was sounded, the dogs will begin to salivate. Pavlov developed a series of acronyms to explain his findings. The NS or neutral stimulus was the bell. The US or unconditioned stimulus was the food. The UCR or unconditioned response was the salivation. The conditioned stimulus became the bell, and the conditioned response became the salivation. So there are four main pairing procedures used in respondent conditioning. There's delayed conditioning, trace conditioning, simultaneous conditioning, and backward conditioning. And I've inserted a quote by O'Hare, who states that the two most effective respondent conditioning procedures are delayed conditioning and trace conditioning. And I'll just give a brief description of all four of these procedures. Delayed conditioning is where the conditioned stimulus is presented firstly, but overlaps with the unconditioned stimulus. With trace conditioning, the conditioned stimulus is presented, then removed before the introduction of the unconditioned stimulus. Simultaneous conditioning is when the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus are presented at the same time. And backward conditioning is when the unconditioned stimulus is presented before the conditioned stimulus. So why does O'Hare believe that both delayed and trace conditioning are more effective than simultaneous and backward conditioning? Delayed conditioning is the most effective procedure, as if using a clicker, for example, the association between the clicker sounding and the treat being provided is learned faster as the food is delivered straight away following the sound of the clicker. If using trace conditioning, the conditioned stimulus is followed shortly by the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus. We have more chance of the dog making the association than with simultaneous conditioning. Again, if using a clicker, for example, the clicker and food are presented at the same time, making it less likely to link an association. If using backward conditioning, this is probably the least effective, simply because the unconditioned stimulus is prevented before the conditioned stimulus, which again, this is very difficult for a dog to make an association. Therefore, simultaneous and backward conditioning are best avoided. This graph displays results of a study carried out by Payen and Asemi in an American dog shelter in 2017. The study was designed to test the effectiveness of a simple respondent conditioning procedure. The study was implemented to reduce the noise levels from the dogs barking. A door chime was paired with giving dogs food at the same time. The overall noise levels in the shelter decreased as a result of intervention. However, Payen and Asemi explain that future researchers should continue to evaluate respondent conditioning procedures to reduce problem behaviour and increase appropriate behaviour in sheltered animals. It was concluded that there may have been several reasons why barking was reduced. It's possible that the door chime became a conditioned stimulus that elicited salivation, which was incompatible with barking. It's also possible that people entering the kennel area were previously aversive to the dogs, therefore barking may have been maintained in the form of escape from people. Dogs were rehomed and taken into the shelter throughout the study, and some dogs may have been introduced during the pairing procedures. Therefore, the dogs had never been introduced to the food rewards, so were not able to make an association with the door chime. The respondent conditioning procedure used in this particular study did not target an unconditioned response, and it was therefore unclear exactly what made the barking decrease. So even though the barking had it decreased because of the use of respondent conditioning? I think this serves as a good example of just how we may be lured into thinking such techniques are producing desired effects, when in fact have we gathered enough accurate information from our clients to embark on an effective behaviour modification programme. Although respondent conditioning is a powerful training tool, unintended consequences may occur if training is not applied correctly. We're going to discuss that in a little bit more depth now. So, what is an interstimulus interval? An interstimulus interval refers to the time gap between two stimuli. For example, if I were teaching a dog to associate the sound of a clicker with a food reward, the interstimulus interval is the time between the clicker sounding and the food being presented. The interval influences how quickly the dog learns the pairing and the association. But what can go wrong? If the interval is too long, the dog may not make the association, so timing is essential in order for the dog to learn quickly and effectively. So what are contingencies and why are they important? Contingencies refer to the relationship of a behaviour and its consequences. And we're going to take a look at the ABC model, or the three-term contingency. So we have the antecedent, which is the trigger that occurs prior to a behaviour. So if I was cueing a dog to sit, that would be the antecedent. B, the behaviour is the action that a dog performs, such as sitting when cued. The consequence is what happens immediately after the behaviour is displayed. For example, the dog gets rewarded with food for sitting. Using the ABC model helps us to shape a dog's behaviour. As trainers and behaviourists, it allows us to be able to manipulate antecedents and consequences to encourage desired behaviours. There is also a four-term contingency, which is ABC, adding in motivating operations, of which there are two types. Establishing operations, they increase the effectiveness of a reinforcer. So, for example, if a dog is hungry prior to training, a food reward will be highly desirable. Secondly, abolishing operations, they decrease the effectiveness of a reinforcer. So again, if a dog has been given dinner prior to a training session, food treats may lose their appeal as the dog becomes satiated. It's important to plan training sessions to allow for this, to make sure that the dog is slightly hungry if you're going to be using food as a highly motivating reinforcer. When using ABC, it's highly important that the antecedent is correctly identified in order to make a correct functional behavioural analysis to commence with a behaviour modification programme. So I'm going to talk very briefly about sensitisation. Sensitisation refers to a process where a dog's reaction to a certain stimulus becomes more heightened with repeated exposure. Problems that may arise if a dog becomes sensitised may be increased reactivity. So, for example, a dog that has encountered unpleasant experiences with other dogs may seem to behave reactively, even when another dog has been spotted at quite some distance away. And such behaviours may include barking or lunging towards the other dog. Chronic anxiety can become an issue if a dog is repeatedly exposed to loud noises, for example, without being desensitized to loud noises firstly. To prevent sensitization occurring in the first place, it's important to use controlled exposures using desensitization techniques and positive reinforcement. With regard to sensitization occurring, prevention is better than management in this case. Habituation is a gradual decline in the magnitude of the respondent behaviour after it has been elicited repeatedly. That's according to Birch and Bailey. So habituation occurs when a dog experiences repeated exposure to a stimulus over a period of time. So, for example, a dog may hate the noise of a vacuum cleaner, but after many repeated exposures, the dog should learn that the vacuum cleaner actually means no harm, and the dog stops responding to the noise. It's just to mention that habituation is not the same as desensitization. Desensitization involves introducing a stimulus at very low intensity and then very slowly increasing the intensity over time. So, to give a brief description of problems that can occur if a dog becomes habituated, and this can be seen quite often throughout the dog training world if a dog is trained by the use of aversives, and in particular anything that causes pain, such as shock collars, prong collars. So a dog may become habituated to the use of an aversive, such as a shock collar. The problem is this can lead to unacceptable consequences. So the dog may become so habituated to a shock collar that it no longer responds to the punishment, which that may then push an owner or trainer into increasing the aversive, which could actually lead to serious injury for the dog. So to end my oral presentation, I'd just like to do a brief recap and conclude that there are 4 different types of respondent conditioning available to us as trainers and behaviourists that can help us to establish and build a hopefully effective behaviour modification programme. The ABC contingency model is obviously very useful, and it's absolutely key that we reiterate to our clients how important it is that they stick to the programme that we've designed for them, and that they fully understand why we have planned the programme the way that we have. Respondent conditioning is an excellent training tool when used correctly. Consequences certainly drive behaviour. So if I'm teaching a dog to sit, for example, the behaviour is the sit, the consequence is a food reward. Something good happening is likely to reinforce that behaviour occurring again. With the tools that we have available to us as training and behaviourists, there is no place for the use of aversive and punishment in modern day dog training and behaviour modification. Thank you for listening. You will see my reference list on the following pages.